Good morning, everyone. Just wait 30 seconds and let people stream in a little more, but we won't take too long today because we want to make the best use of our time. All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to our fifth Paddock to Planning Forum, this time on urban and peri-urban agriculture. My name's Milo Kelly from DPI Agriculture's Agricultural Land Use and Planning Team, or ALUP, as you might have run into us as. For those that haven't dialed in before, Paddock to Planning is our web forum series about planning issues for agriculture. In particular, it's aimed at councils, but we're happy to have anyone here who has an interest, whether it's state government, consultants, or members of the public too. In fact, today's event's been our highest registration yet, so clearly there's a lot of interest going on. I'll just move into it so that we make use of our time. First, an acknowledgement of country. The Department of Regional New South Wales acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and we show our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We're committed to providing places in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally, and economically through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. Bit of housekeeping, the session's going to be recorded, so keep your camera off if you don't want to be filmed, and please stay on mute. If you have any questions, add them to the chat and we're going to get to them at the end. Otherwise, we're pretty keen to see a lively chat in general, so post away. And feel free to also use our ideas wall from our Paddock to Planning website, and there should be a link to that in the chat. We'd like to see this be a little bit of a space where some of these topics can be discussed further outside of the limits of this Zoom webinar. As usual, we got a topic that's far too big to cover in an hour's webinar, and we definitely don't have all the answers to boot. So the plan with today's talk is instead to kick off a broader discussion by providing a brief overview of urban and peri-urban agriculture, which I'll be doing first, and then we'll be hearing from two very different people working in this space to provide their own perspectives. First is going to be Evelyn Ivinson from the Department of Planning, but she's going to be taking that hat off to talk to us about her own independent research with Macquarie University about enabling urban agriculture in the New South Wales planning system. And you might have noticed this research earned a recommendation at the Planning Institute of Australia's New South Wales Awards for Planning Excellence last year. And then, because we like to hear directly from producers too, we got Aaron Brocken here from Harvest Farms in Bilpin, who's going to be talking about his experience as a farmer in Sydney's peri-urban region and the benefit it brings to the community. After that, we're going to be opening up to a Q&A session and discussion, which might well roll over time if there's enough interest going on. And we'll be sending out resources after the meeting, including the video recording and the slides, some references and further reading and anything else interesting that comes from the discussion. So stay tuned for that. All right, so what is urban and peri-urban agriculture? First, it's important to note that agriculture has always been a part of our cities and towns. And in particular, it's traditionally been the source of perishable food like fresh veggies, poultry, and dairy, which often need proximity to markets still today and often have very high labor requirements. The image here is from the historic market gardens at La Perouse, which have been at work for more than 150 years as an example of that. These days, though, longer supply chains have been increasing competition from afar, and at the same time, urbanizations put pressure on peri-urban land. So all these things together have been displacing local production. But there's been growing interest in local food production in recent decades, and because of this, we've started seeing it be considered by different levels of government, particularly local government. And there's some recent examples of this shown on the right, which you might or might not have run into. No doubt, most people are going to be familiar with urban and peri-urban agriculture, but probably have different ideas about what that means. And one important point we'd like you to take away is that it's very diverse in its form, its function, and its role. And it can include anything from backyard production and kind of inner urban social enterprises right through to commercial production. Oh, looks like I was just muted for a sec. Back on. It can also include market gardens, protected cropping, and livestock too. So you might have run into only a couple of these in your area, but it can sometimes be very inconspicuous. So you really got to be prepared to look around quite closely. We'd really like to ram home just how substantial this kind of production can be, in this case by looking at some production statistics for the Greater Sydney region. These ones are from the ABS for the financial year 2020 to 2021. And in that year, Greater Sydney's agriculture had a gross value of more than $700 million, spread out among over 1,000 businesses and with more than 6,700 people directly employed. What might surprise you even more is that it had the highest veggie production by value of any region in New South Wales, over $200 million, or a third of the state's total, as you can see on that graph there on the right. It also had the second highest production of egg and poultry meat. And this goes back to that point before about the importance of proximity to markets and labour for certain types of ag. And for those who are interested in these sorts of ag statistics, we really encourage you to muck around with our new agricultural and land use dashboard, Ag Track, and there should be a link to that in the chat. Of course, the reasons for supporting this kind of agriculture goes far beyond economics, as you can tell from the community interest, and we're going to touch on a lot of those in the course of this webinar. With that being a very, very brief background on what urban and peri-urban ag is and why it's important, we're going to go into, unfortunately, a similarly brief review of some of the steps that local governments and the planning system can take to support it. These are some of the actions that have been included in various food and planning policies throughout Australia, plus recommendations of research on the topic too. So we'll be giving out a detailed version of this list with resources and case studies, etc., as part of our follow-up information after the event. And we'd also love to hear any examples you have of these or any other actions. So chuck them in the chat as we go. Anyway, let's run through a couple of different actions from this list, which we've put into 4 categories, including the next slide for people who are trying to count. In terms of strategy and governance, putting in the work to identify and map the entire food landscape is important. And this is probably a very familiar theme for people involved in any kind of strategic planning or strategy in general. But in this case, it's important to include the entire supply chain from production to distribution, as well as any stakeholders involved or who benefit from it. When it comes to production, this would include, of course, protecting ag lands and resources. And it might also include integrating production into public land, like leasing out land to market gardeners or creating community gardens. Supporting distribution's also really, really important in this space because you've got both small producers and consumers who often want to interact outside of the conventional sort of supermarket setting. For the producers, that's often to get access to markets, niche markets often. And on the other side, it's to access all the additional benefits that can come along with local production. So direct sales methods like farmers markets and farm gate sales are really important, but they depend on their consideration in the planning system and by support from councils. Among other things as well, there's great opportunities, we think, for increasing the viability of farm gate sales by promoting farm trails like Hawkesbury Harvest, which Aaron's going to be talking about a bit later, or by providing visitor amenities and infrastructure on public land that's near clusters of farm gates. And finally, potential impacts and land use conflicts are important. in these mixed use zones. And because of the diversity of forms of production that we showed, the impacts can vary a lot based on that use. So we always recommend requiring a LUCRA or a land use conflict risk assessment to support any planning decisions for agriculture or for adjacent development. And of course, buffers are a really good tool here to implement where they work, ideally at the strategic stage. So we're now going to hand over to Evelyn, who's going to be talking about her research on one of these points, which was on the previous slide, which was supporting production through relaxing permissibility controls for urban agriculture. Just before we do, though, we'll just quickly ask about the values or the potential values you associate with urban and peri-urban agriculture. You might want to select them all, but maybe just 3 ideally to give us a bit of idea. It's definitely not scientific. And while you do the poll, just as a bit of a case in point, these background images are from Bangladeshi market garden that I visited for research in Leppington in Western Sydney last year. And this one's one of the only farms in New South Wales that makes South Asian veg, and probably beyond that too. So on weekends in the summer, you can find a chock-a-block with families shopping and walking around enjoying the farm. You can see a few quotes I have there which cover off on some of these values you're thinking about possibly. And really relevant to our discussion today is that this place is part of the Southwest Growth Area that's been rezoned industrial for many years now. And if it has to relocate, you can imagine there's going to be an impact on achieving some of these values for the community. All right, we might just take a quick look at those poll results.
Yeah, thanks, Milo. Are you able to see the screen? Or?
I actually can see them, yeah. So there's a good range actually on there. Very interested to hear if you have any others that aren't on there. We didn't want to have a list as long as anyone's arm. But yeah, there's a really wide range of benefits depending on your perspective. A lot of these, depends on how it's done. So all of it's good to think about as we go ahead anyway. We'll touch on a few of these later, particularly in Aaron's talk, I think. So with that, I'll hand over to Evelyn for your talk. Evelyn.
Thanks, Milo. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this morning. It's good to see so much interest in what I believe is a very important topic. So as Milo said, I am a town planner at the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, but I actually undertook research independently of that, bridging my knowledge of planning with my passion for growing food in urban areas. And I wanted to actually identify any planning frameworks that actually have enabled different types of urban agriculture, from urban farms to rooftop gardens and indoor horticulture. And so I wanted to examine the New South Wales planning framework and see how well set up it is to actually get to that point of enabling agriculture to be practiced. Firstly, what we know is that as of last year, 36% of Australians were found to be food insecure. That rate is increasing. The previous year it was 21%, and around 10 years ago it was 11%. And that is represented by the number of families that are seeking food from food charities. And it is quite a stark number. What I have also found out is that urban agriculture is enabled through strong land use planning governance. And so when we hear about governance as part of the food security problem, governance to me also encapsulates the role of planners in trying to develop solutions. We know food systems are vulnerable. We're seeing that across Australia with droughts and floods, increased prices that have skyrocketed. Everybody is affected by that, including those that are actually growing food as well. There is also very little research on planning frameworks that actually have practiced food production. So I actually identified a gap in the research that didn't actually analyse how successful planning frameworks are established. What do they need to cover to actually have effect on the ground? So I then moved to looking at how land use governance, policies and regulations can create the space for both community and commercial ventures to improve food systems to better society. Just touching on food security and food justice and the intersection of both of those within planning frameworks. Just some definitions. Food security is about everybody having access to what we believe are culturally acceptable and nutritious food, having enough food in non-emergency times. And food justice is about ensuring that everybody has equitable access to fresh food so that they're not impeded by race or exploitation or oppression. And at the centre of both is how urban planning can actually create a logical and coherent framework to food security, and perhaps even specialise in it to identify some solutions in terms of both statutory and strategic land use planning. So before I touch on Australia's governance framework relating to food security, Helen's got a poll up, and it's really just asking what you think the role of the state government is in supporting urban and peri-urban agriculture. And whilst you do this, I'd also like you to think about strategies that government could consider at all levels, whether it's local, state or federal government. I'm moving into a PhD now, and I'd really welcome ideas that could be considered, whether they be specific examples or strategies that would be worth considering. All right, so just a bit of knowledge about what's happened at a federal level. So in 2013, a national food plan was introduced. It was designed to improve Australia's food security, the livability index and health outcomes. And it sought to reduce food insecurity in partnership with state and territory governments, industry and the community. A priority of that food plan was to prepare a national urban policy that considered the impact of urbanisation on the potential loss of productive land, and to ensure Australians have access to safe and nutritious food. And it charged the state and territory governments to set the direction for that. But unfortunately, there was no further guidance or linkage to actually implement that. So it really didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. In Victoria, there is a different approach to requiring councils to permit agricultural uses. So it's not a flexible approach, it's actually mandated. And whilst the definitions of agriculture in Victoria are not yet aligned neatly enough to recognise the urban agricultural setting, it has gone further than in New South Wales, which I'll touch on the next slide. So having said that, the Metropolitan Framework in Sydney is a strategic document that talks about local councils and other agencies promoting local access to fresh food and supporting local fresh food production. But there's no line of sight direction to local councils as to how to do that. And that was a comment made by one of the councils that I interviewed, that there's no line of sight. And if there was a line of sight, councils would have the resources and the tools and the knowledge to actually implement that at a local planning level. There have been two parliamentary inquiries related to this issue. The first is a New South Wales one from 2021, and that sought to have a food security plan developed by the New South Wales government. There has not been a response yet to that from the government. And the other is a Commonwealth level one that was only introduced last year. So just looking at some of the definitions of agriculture, not urban agriculture, in the New South Wales State Planning Framework, you can see 5 categories, 5 colours in the chart on the right. They're very broad categories and they tend to lend themselves to rural and regional areas. And I will stress that I don't see any need to alter what happens in regional areas. I think they are absolutely critical for Australia's food supply. But what I do see is a lack of attention taken to how those uses could fit in an urban context. On the left-hand side is a list of council LEPs, local environmental plans, that I reviewed to see how they approach permitting any of these uses. And the results show that there is very limited take-up by councils to permit agricultural uses. Now, agricultural uses are typically categorised as either aquaculture or extensive ag, intensive ag, or intensive plant ag or horticulture. The state government directs that councils should permit different types of aquaculture in urban zones. Yet it's not a use that is typically seen in urban areas. It's not that it can't be done, and it is being done, but it is very limited. There's no responsiveness towards tailoring any of those agricultural uses to urban farms, smaller blocks, orchards, tree nurseries, and those sorts of things. The first line where the orange boxes are, many of the council reps attending will know about this. There is flexibility in choosing to permit those uses, unlike the Victorian model. The red box that shows the Sydney LEP shows the council of the 10 I surveyed that has probably a more progressive response towards permitting different types of agriculture in business zones. I've just got a snapshot of the business zones. And you can see the second column, the third column, the B2 local centre, shows that all types of agriculture except for plant-based aquaculture are actually permitted in that area, in that zone. And similarly in the B5 business development zone. And also the B8, which is not on the screen, but it is this, the city centre. So there's a much more flexible approach. So looking at some Sydney examples, I looked at 3 urban farms across the metropolitan region. The first one is in the Inner West LGA. It is Pocket City Farms, which is leased. It's on Crown land. It's zoned for public recreation. And there is no definition, no land use term that captures urban farms. So legally speaking, the use is not permitted, but it is enabled through a lease arrangement. Sydney City Farm is in the City of Sydney LGA. The agricultural example I gave on the previous page is not actually, the terms are not permitted in this zone, but it's not an obstacle to having this site in operation. And I will also note that the site is actually on an old tip. So the land is contaminated, but the farm can operate because it is, the beds are enclosed and the produce is grown in raised beds. So there is no interaction with the soil. Green Connect in Warrawong is in Wollongong LGA. The site is leased from schools infrastructure and it's zoned for residential purposes. And again, similar approach, agricultural uses as currently defined are not permitted in that zone, but it serves a wonderful operation to engage migrants and former refugees and train them up. So they develop skills and there is a local co-op where people can actually purchase the produce. I also looked at indoor horticulture. So there's 2 sites in the City of Sydney LGA. Inverted Grow is at Green Square and horticulture is a permitted use in the industrial area. It's a fabulous site that pilots the ability to have standalone produce growing in controlled environments. Urban Green at Barangaroo, it's a similar setup. It's, as I said, the B8 zone, so it's the most intense business zone, and yet there is no hindrance to actually permitting horticulture in that area. I spoke to a number of informants from councils. I interviewed New South Wales Health and the State Department of Planning as well as case study operators. One of the comments from Liverpool Council was that there's really little difference in these sorts of operations to data centres other than the amount of data that's consumed. A lot of the water's recycled, nutrients are controlled, and there's really little land use conflicts to have concern about. I will say I looked at rooftop gardens, but I could really only find one example of an edible rooftop garden, and it was really done as a design response in that building, not through any arrangement, and it was the Yerrabingan site over at the former ATP site. Internationally, I've looked at what is happening there. What are some of the planning responses to permitting urban agriculture? The City of Detroit is probably the most pronounced. You can see the example for those of us planning nerds who love a land use table. You can see the ticks there that show different types of agriculture that are well defined to urban areas. It looks at agriculture on less than an acre. So it's a clear definition and it's permitted in residential and business zones. And similarly, those other uses have got different levels of permissibility. Detroit went through a massive deindustrialisation process in the 1970s. And prior to 2013, when this was introduced, urban farming was illegal, yet people were doing it because they really had to make sure they had access to fresh food. The middle one, Flint in Michigan, is actually a strategic plan. It's actually a land inventory mapping process that emerged and identified where land could be used to grow food. And it is those green areas. They are typically along public spaces and along the creek, but there are further afield different areas as well. But at the same time, the document also had a map of the socioeconomic levels of the town, and those at the lowest level were furthest away from the areas identified that are suitable for urban agriculture. Article 89 in Boston is a well-known zoning code. It permits commercial agriculture. And as a result, there's been a lot of activity happening, both of a community and commercial nature across the city. There's also been a response to permitting green roofs across Canada and Europe and in New York City. Green roofs are not necessarily, they're not mandated to be used to grow food, but they have the capacity for that. And New York City actually went further a few years ago and required 100% of rooftops on new buildings to be green. So it's not an option. So I mentioned I interviewed a number of informants. These are the issues that were prominent in the discussions I had. There was general consensus that there are limitations in the New South Wales statutory framework toward enabling urban agriculture. And there also is a lot of value of urban agriculture, and they translate to things like reduced food miles, knowing where your food comes from, community connections and empowerment. But there are barriers and opportunities for urban agriculture. But there were suggestions that we need evidence to support it. We need to look at where it's being done well. We don't have to go far. City of Sydney already is moving towards doing what they can within the current framework. And in Victoria, there have been significant moves to have food strategies created by local councils. And we need leadership, and that needs to happen at a state level and even at a Commonwealth level. So some of the recommendations that I have identified are that we should identify the stakeholders responsible to address those planning shortfalls across government, and we need an enabling governance environment. So we need to define urban agricultural land uses and have an enabling policy setting that promotes urban agriculture in collaboration with stakeholders. And those stakeholders include food security advocates and industry players. And councils need support to implement a strategy. Without that, it's very hard for councils to go it alone. And I did hear that directly from one council. And as I mentioned, we should be promoting best practice urban agriculture. We can look to our international examples and borrow from them. They've already done the work. So it really is about making sure we can work, perhaps partner with them, pick up what they know, find out how it's worked and what some of the challenges have been, and adapt it to the New South Wales framework. So in conclusion, it's clear that cities beyond Australia are adopting planning measures that enable urban agriculture, and Sydney's lagging behind. There is a fundamental regulatory role for our planning framework to contribute to food security and food justice solutions, and that can generate community participation as well as economic investment. But currently the system doesn't sufficiently support urban agricultural operators to secure suitable land and operate with certainty. There should not be a reliance on leases, which are tenuous. It should be an underlying permissible framework that actually recognises and mandates these uses as accepted. I do see urban agriculture as a form of social infrastructure. It's something that we're not talking about in our strategic planning, and we need to be picking that up. It can be incorporated into our greening strategies, and it can be seen as having direct benefits at a local level. And local councils need state level guidance. So I have got my email address there at Macquarie Uni. I do encourage you to reach out if you have questions or suggestions. And I will be looking to do some pilot work in my PhD. So if anyone is interested in reaching out, please do so. And thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Evelyn. And yeah, load up some questions in the chat for Evelyn at the end after we hear from Aaron. And while we pass over to Aaron, we'll just chuck another poll up to pest you with on what are the main barriers you think exist to urban and peri-urban agriculture? Pick 3 once again. because there's probably more. Very interesting. I can see it coming through, but we'll get Helen to share in a minute. We can see that land use conflict and increasing land values are figuring as the main ones from the crowd here. I wonder how much of that surprises anyone. I think. Well, anyway, we can get back to that, but feel free to add your comments or any other ones that you've thought of that weren't there. And we'll now hand over to Aaron, if you're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Milo. Well, hi, everyone. Just thought I would be talking a little bit more about sort of a living example of some peri-urban agriculture, what I would call peri-urban agriculture. So yeah, this is a slide of my market garden, which is for about 8 years now. It was under an acre. It's now gone up to 3 acres, and we supply restaurants in Sydney. We supply 4 organic shops around Sydney, and we supply about 70 people with a community support agriculture, which is a weekly or fortnightly box of veggies. So it's about 70 families we do there. So yeah, I'm up in Bilpin. It's about an hour and a half out of Sydney, and this block of land here was an old orchard, which I sort of took on. It went out of business in the 90s, and so I've taken it on and started to do a market garden here, essentially just to sort of keep agriculture going on the land. It's about a 20-acre block of land. There's an old orchard there which I'm sort of restoring as well. And for sure, this block would have been subdivided if the owners would have had an opportunity to do so. So yeah, I just thought I'd be going over some of the examples of why I think that farms are useful in these spaces. So yeah, if you want to go on to the next slide, Milo, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me, because I grew up in this area, was the loss of agriculture over my lifetime. So there's about 36 orchards here in Bilpin when I was growing up. There's only about 6 left now, and I guess, you know, for me it was striking because I don't think these farms went out of business through lack of trying. There was a lot of heartbreak, I guess, involved with the losing of this agriculture. And I guess one of the worst things for me, I guess, to see when you start to see agriculture disappearing in these peri-urban areas is the loss of skills. The average age of farmer, this is the last I heard anyway, the average age of farmers in the Hawkesbury where we are is around 60 years old. And I think that's striking for a number of reasons. I think one of the most striking things for me is that we're losing a loss of skills here. I see it as a craft, and I'd like to see it kept as a craft. And I think it's an important thing for communities, and we're actually losing a lot of knowledge. So I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see, whether we like it or not, a huge change in the agricultural population, or the people that are getting into agriculture. And I think if we don't really be careful, we're going to lose a huge skill set and a lot of knowledge around farming there. So another thing too, I mean, Bilpin is known as the land of the mountain apple. There's a big sign that calls it the land of the mountain apple as you're coming up the mountain. And I think it's important to sort of see the agriculture in this area as part of the history of the place. And it's a lot of the orchards here still have some rare varieties of apples. Those 6 left, and some of the old disused ones. These are essentially kind of like a living archives of our varieties and things like that. And I guess if we start to lose that sort of, you know, orchards that we have, then we're losing a large part in our area of what a lot of people sort of relate to in terms of what our area is. So it's important, I think, to sort of look at agricultural areas as kind of these places start to get developed as part of the history, and of course the culture too. A big part of what brings tourists up here and things like that too is to see these beautiful orchards. And I think a lot of people relate to these things as part of our cultural context. So if you want to go to the next slide, one of the main things I really wanted to point out, and I mean Evelyn sort of touched on a lot of these things, but I wanted to sort of give again a living example of it. Is I'd really like people to consider farms as more than just packages of food producing lands, and start to look at the intrinsic values that they have within the community. I think a big part of it is an education, a place for kids to play, a place for kids to learn and be outdoors and whatnot. And I think so. This is me and my father giving an excursion to one of the local schools, but we also take schools from Sydney. We have a lot of school excursions there, and it's a great day for the kids to learn about their food. And I think the more peri-urban agriculture we have, again, hopefully we can see that as an intrinsic value to the youth in the area. Because I think we all know now that, like, learning about food is a very important part of kids' health and well-being and their eating habits and whatnot too. I think every subject within the school can be touched on within a farm and given practical examples for the kids to learn from. And it's a great space for them to run around and things too. So that's that one. And food waste, I think, is on the tip of everyone's tongue now. I know if you're into town planning and things like that. I mean, here in the Hawkesbury, we're looking at filling up our local tip. Last I heard, within a few years, we're going to be really starting to feel the pressure of our tip being at capacity. Food waste is a huge part of that, and I think farms can play an intricate role in our circular economy. I think everybody would have heard that buzzword now. We take 200 kilos of food food scrap from the restaurants we deliver to in a circular economy system, whereby they're actually getting food dropped off, and we're taking that food back to the farm. We have a number of composting systems within the farm to create soil and compost for our garden beds. We also take about 100 kilos of coffee grounds from the local McDonald's at Richmond. These are good sort of advertising points for these companies too, to show that they're doing good things to reduce the waste. It's stopping that waste being trucked around. It's stopping that waste from going into like methane gases and things, which it sometimes happens within tips as well. So I guess there's a lot more to that circular economy and the food waste that I think that really, if people are pushing to get agriculture happening, we can touch on. Land management, I think, is a big thing. I think traditionally people have been using animals to graze land for thousands of years, and I can see in France, for example, the local government and the fire brigade and also national parks work with the shepherds there to manage weeds, reduce bushfire hazards and things. And essentially, it's a way for farmers and people to be looking, observing the lands and managing it for ongoing use. And if land use is done properly, and I think this is synonymous with farming in the land, because obviously there's a vested interest in healthy ecosystems within the farm, so that the plants can survive better. So I think that keeping spaces for farming, we run goats and sheep on the property as well, and we use them to reduce weeds within the property. And I think that these are a huge aspect that council would really, it would behoove them to look into these sorts of things and working with farmers to managing land better. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I think, and I'll get on to agritourism in a second. I just wanted to touch quickly on the opportunities for migrants to engage in meaningful work. on farms, and I'm not suggesting that all migrants should be getting into agriculture, but I think we've had some hugely successful programs with the Sudanese community and working with Settlement Services International and refugees, and a lot of the people that are coming from agrarian societies, I guess. And so agricultural spaces within land not only provides them with some meaningful work to engage within the community, it also allows us to use their skill sets that they have. We've learnt amazing crops and things like that from migrants, and I think we really need to see them as the asset they are to our communities. And I think it really helps for people to integrate and understand these people when they're embedded in their food systems and supplying them at their local markets and things like that. So we'll keep on moving. I'll touch on this briefly because I think for a lot of people it might not mean a lot, but it's really important to farmers and anybody who's getting into this on a deeper level that we're losing a lot of varieties within our agricultural context. And so we're basically at this point in time losing huge numbers of different varieties, and as soon as we've lost them, they're gone. And I think the increase of peri-urban production would also increase the diversity and scalability of those crops. Thank you. So to do this, we have seed saving groups within our communities on the farm as well. And again, I would like to see everybody farming in their backyard. I'd like to see everyone have at least pot plants, even on their windowsills and things like that too. But again, coming back to farming being a craft, if we have these people that have dedicated their lives to farming within the communities, they're the people that people come to with questions about, you know, how to save their seeds. This is our grafting day. We've grafted about 50 different varieties of apples into this old orchard now, and we're talking about keeping that wood for the community to then use in their backyards too. So there's a huge role to play there, I think, for increasing the overall food security of a community just by having a farm in there. Heat island effects. I won't dwell too much on this. I'm sure a lot of you know a lot more about it than me too. But I guess I just wanted to touch on it too and make sure that it was being mentioned and thought of, that the simple act of having farms in a community and green areas not only increases the coolness of the area and the buffers the heat coming into an area, but also, again, if farming's done properly, then there'll be biostrips and things like that on the farm that increases biodiversity and is also important for ecosystems within communities. We also do open days, and this is coming into that food tourism. We do 5-course lunches on our farm, whereby the chefs that we deliver to come out and get a chance to interact with people. Again, you know, coming into tourism, this is a huge thing for the area. People know this area for agriculture. When people come into local restaurants and they see local food on the menu, this is really important to them. They're going to go for that every time. And it gives people, I see chefs as artists in a lot of ways. And I think that having local farms increases their palate to be able to sort of do what they do. So that's really important too. Farmers markets. So as Milo mentioned earlier, since I started farming, I've been a part of Hawkesbury Harvest, or Harvest Trails and Markets as it's now known. And we get a lot of calls from people from organisations and councils wanting to activate their spaces, you know, whether it be in a mall or in a park or anything that they want to open up. They want to really get activity around an area. And farmers markets is obviously an obvious answer to that question. And for 2 years, I ran a farmers markets at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, and the benefits to that place was quite amazing too. Having legitimate farmers and genuine growers that can come to that market and provide to that market is a huge plus. Also, as a segue into land stewardship, I think that farming and land management is a beautiful way in which we can interact with our Indigenous landowners and look at ways to which we can care for the land and the longevity of it. I think that's a huge thing with a huge scope that I would love to talk more about, but I'm conscious of time. So if there's any questions about that, I guess I can answer that later.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. It's a really wide-ranging perspective on the value, and we're really keen to get people plugging in any questions from Aaron and maybe going and checking out what he's doing or other producers in the area to get a bit of direct insight into this. We'll move on to a discussion now, just from questions in the comments to begin with. And the first one I can see, which we might jump off to, Aaron, is there is a question around the impact of kind of planning changes and mixed use landscapes. You've kind of noted in one spot that having these opportunities for events is really important. But I think what that question's also getting to is, how do you balance that need and that change with the increase in things like land use conflict or pressures to subdivide, etc.? How do you and the community around you at least perceive that dynamic?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. I think I don't pay rent on my farm is something I wanted to mention too. Essentially, I have a handshake agreement and have had for the last 8 years with the landowner, whereby I use the land and help to manage his land. And it essentially, he's 86, basically help him carry his groceries from the car to the house and look after him, keep an eye out on him and things like that too. And I think instead of looking at conflicts, for me, it's been the opposite, really. It's a hugely beneficial relationship with the neighbours. Obviously, the fresh produce next to them, there's never been any issues with that. And people are willing to. I've had several other neighbours offer me properties up here to simply farm on too. There's been. I think we need to really change that idea that farming is something negative to the land, and the right sort of agriculture. If we can look at it as being positive, then why wouldn't people want farmers there? Even if they're not paying for it. So I think, yeah, conflict has never been an issue for me, so I can't really comment on the conflict aspects. I just like to flip it around and look at the positive aspects of it. I don't know if that really answers the question too much. But
That's awesome. It's a very tricky space to work through. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Evelyn. Might partially touch on your examination of urban areas.
I think there needs to be a concerted effort to actually protect areas that do have productive capacity, whether it's in urban or peri-urban, because the threat of housing expansion is always there. The housing policy agenda is huge. And whilst it's obviously very important, I do think also what's equally important is making sure we do protect land that has arable productivity or can be created to or recovered, because once it's lost, it's lost. It's very hard to retrospectively build those areas up again, put them back in and designate them for that purpose. And community gardens are what we're most familiar with. Those areas are set aside. A lot of those spaces that I know of are actually owned by Department of Housing. So they're part of social housing complexes. And those community gardens, I know of two nearby where I live, and they are owned by housing, and they're allowed to continue as community gardens. But yeah, I think there needs to be probably a more public agenda to protect those areas.
Wonderful. While we got you there were a few questions about what your research, including ongoing, looks like. Evelyn, do you want to have any more comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually wanting to perhaps do a bit of an ethnographic study to identify what's important to people who do want access to locally grown food, either through active participation or just through being able to purchase what's grown locally. So I'm looking to explore some demographics across metro and regional areas that identify areas of need to firstly see if there's that direct correlation between people who are of a lower socioeconomic status and would be interested. And quite often, looking at migrant communities does create those openings, because a lot of migrants do typically grow food. They have come with their knowledge, and if they have a backyard, they'll be doing it there. But if they don't, they'll be looking for space at a community garden. So I'm really interested in that angle. I also want to explore doing a pilot with a few councils to review their planning frameworks and see what it could look like if we were enabling urban agriculture. The big challenge is the definitions as they stand. So it's looking to see what we could do currently, because it would be great to know what councils' attitudes are, particularly those that have lost a lot of arable land. When you think of Liverpool, it's so much more dense, and that's just one example. And similarly in regional areas, there seems to be an emphasis on the regional and rural productivity, and yet there are still pockets within urban centres that have potential, and that was one of the comments. So I'd like to make sure I'm covering off on case studies across those different environments.
Great. There was some questions around hazards and flood, and I might just switch over to Aaron again for a minute. You've probably, I don't know how it affects so much up in Bilpin and the geography there, but obviously flood impacted and maybe bushfires. There's been a lot of hazards in the past few years. How has that been impacting the growing community around you, and what would that mean for spatial planning going forward, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that comes back to that land stewardship. So in 19, I lost everything I had in the bushfires there. Managed to save like the livestock, but I lost the shed and a lot of crops and irrigation, all the tools and things like that too. So definitely it affects us. Insurance and things like that is a hard thing, and that comes back to planning too. With the handshake agreements that I have, it's a little bit hard to really get things insured. But there's some opportunities, and of course the heavy rains and floods for a market gardener are devastating as well. So we've lost a lot there. But yeah, again, having someone on the property too, to manage to we save fences, look after the place. Again, reduce the bushfire hazards through better management of the property. If agriculture is not happening on these properties, a lot of people come from towns to retire into the country and think it's going to be a nice, easy life, but they don't realise that there's a lot of land management that needs to happen. So I think, I think it's just good to have people on there looking after the property.
Great. Yeah, and I remember when I was talking to those Bangladeshi farmers, for example, they'd been pretty traumatized being market gardeners and having like 2 years crops destroyed by the flood, as you kind of said. And part of their stress about finding a new area was making sure as much as possible it wasn't particularly flood prone, which is tricky when you add it into the other calculus of kind of strategic planning, because a lot of that gets pushed into those areas, which makes sense, but it also needs to be balanced a bit. This might be something you're aware of or maybe not, Evelyn, but we had a question about DPHI or whatever it was back then, years ago, looking at the potential for individuals to lease large tracts of R5 land, so large lot residential land for food production, where land use conflict can be minimized. And it might have been in the Riverina area. So it might not be something you're familiar with, but do you have any comments on that?
I'm not familiar with it. I think it's probably an interesting model that would be good to find out a bit more about and see what are some of the structures around making that happen. So yeah, it would be good, because that's being primarily residential. What does that mean for that area? Is it a case by case scenario? Or, I mean, it must have been a one-off, but it would be good to know how that can be replicated. How do you identify the land that could be suitable for food production? And it goes to what Aaron was talking about, and the the prevalence towards flood prone land and the risks associated with that. How do you get the better land to grow food? How can we be more innovative about it? so that we're using our space as well.
I might even invite Melissa Ward, who posted that question, to see if she has any extra insight on that. And yeah, if you're interested, Melissa, that is, you can give a thumbs down.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear
me? Yeah,
me?
we can hear you.
Oh, great. Yeah, it was an idea that was brought up years ago, and I actually didn't hear what happened with it in the end. So I was actually putting that up to see if anyone knew any more about it, because I found it quite interesting.
Maybe if anyone else knows, they can post that in the chat. But possibly similar to that, Aaron, you were talking about, getting access to your farm through a handshake deal, and you'd spoken to us earlier about assisting other young farmers with those sort of land sharing arrangements, often to get access to farms from older owners. And this might get around some of those barriers which are identified in the poll around land value as preventing entry to new farmers. Would you be happy to explain a bit more about that model?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was pretty involved in setting up an organisation over here called Farm It Forward. It's in the Lower Blue Mountains, that actually because there's a huge amount of young people. I mean, I spoke about the migrants coming to Australia and having job opportunities for them, but there's so many young people in the area where we're essentially getting told by the universities or whatever that agriculture is just not viable in the peri-urban areas and where they grew up, and the only way to do it is to go out west and get a big farm and things like that too. And so I think it's important, to have these spaces where it wasn't appealing for me to move outside of my community to continue farming. It's not really what I wanted to do, and I don't think it is for a lot of young people. So I think having these different things. I mean, Liam, I saw in the comments too, was talking about some land availability arrangements around Paris and in France and things like that too. There's so many different things that local governments can do to really provide spaces for young people to either put tiny homes on properties. There's in France, coming back in France again, there's shepherds' cabins that essentially, when someone buys a block of land, they have to let the shepherds use that land. For example, they have to have cabins there with Wi-Fi, so shepherds can have, Wi-Fi and raise a family to do, while they do what they're doing while they're doing it, and things like that too. So I think just needs to be the more opportunities that it doesn't take much, and it's beneficial for the landowners, the area, as I discussed, and job opportunities for young people wanting to get into agriculture too. So I think we really need to open our minds to those different availabilities.
Too good. There was some work going on in the Tweed area, I think, to that effect too. I think exploring new models for land sharing and whatnot too, because that is a really big issue, especially when you're talking about these newer forms of sustainable and kind of connected agriculture, is often driven by young people. And as we know, the story with land values often prevents that, without people having to move very far away from their communities. And in the same process, they lose access to those markets too, which are often really important, those direct kind of connections, to maintain those kind of businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Farm It Forward's put about 7 young people onto properties of elderly and disabled people. And essentially, that's they're looking after those people and their properties as well.
Too good. We did have a very, very big question at the top from Ian about what is the plan for what's going to happen to all this agriculture which is being displaced. A lot of it already is subject to rezoning, and I think there's a lot of research to that effect that Sydney stands to lose a large amount of its production. I don't know that there's an answer and who's that's going to be directed to, but perhaps something to think about.
I'm happy to make a comment there, Milo. We've been working a little bit with the Western Sydney Planning Partnership, and they've done some economic research into the future of agriculture in the Western Sydney Basin, and the future is not looking great without good policy change, really. So I'd really be happy if anyone's got any suggestions about what we can do in this space. Obviously, that's sort of the crux of the problems in planning at the moment for agriculture, is what's happening in Sydney. And I expect we'll get those same issues up and down the coastline, and likely to be worsened with climate change and drought migration for agricultural producing industries. So anyone that's got any solutions or ideas, love to hear them.
Yes, we're all ears. Look, this is getting pretty much to time, and we're going to roll over just in case anyone has some comments going on. But I will say on your way out, and thanks very much for coming, we have a survey which we'd love you to respond to, hopefully very quick, on this event, and also to register if you have any interest in anything going forward. We don't have a concept of what that would look like, or who would be involved. You know, DPI or others. It would definitely require, working with a few different bodies, as this kind of space generally requires. But please jump into that survey on your way out if you can. And after that, we might just open up to the floor. If anyone wants to put their hand up using that function in the chat, we'll do it that way. Questions or comments?
I'm happy to start a bit of a discussion, Milo. Someone in the chat mentioned, I'm always good for a chat, hey? Someone in the chat mentioned education as something that might be super helpful. And we have started an education program, but if anyone's got anything specific, like how detailed an education program would you like, and what do you think, we should focus on? If anyone's got any suggestions around that, that'd be great. And I know New South Wales Health's been in this meeting as well. So if you guys have any suggestions about what you'd like to see, that'd be awesome too. So just want to make sure the work we're doing sort of is meeting the need of people and helping, ag have a prosperous future.
There was recently grants for school excursions. The funding for that has dried up now, I think. But that was quite a good program. We engaged a teacher to develop a curriculum embedded excursion program, so the teachers could essentially just tick a lot of boxes in terms of what curriculum they had to sort of, I guess, the things that they had to achieve, and then come to the farm, and we could just incorporate that into some post and pre-learning at the schools and things like that too. So for primary schools and high schools, I think that it'd be great to see those programs supported again by local government. I think they're really beneficial.
Any other comments on education while we're at it? Well, if not, we did have another
one.
Jump in, Andrew.
Thought was, Milo, was agricultural is or these type of farms are deemed a small business, and so there's been in the past work done, I thought, through the Small Business Commissioner, and maybe that's a bit that's sort of missing a bit, in that these farms won't work unless they're economically viable. So you got to there must be some support somewhere from small business planning, marketing side. So I think if you're looking for a catch, where to go, I think we've got to try and engage with that. Oh, you've got to. Not me anymore. You've got to try and engage with the, small business incentives that have been out there by state government.
Yeah, I think I've heard that kind of thing a bit, especially because the cost of getting these sort of startups going, and particularly in the face of like climate vulnerability, like I said, with those Bangladeshi farmers, they were itching for something like that to assist them both to start up and to recover from events which can knock you out at the start pretty well. We had an interesting comment from Andrew about the South Coast, where the barrier was, there's plenty of land up for lease, but not the growers. And the issue there is around the lease conditions potentially to make it viable to have long-term leases, if I understood correctly, Andrew. No, who was that? So, yeah, Andrew Britt. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Milo. I've been out of it for probably a couple of years, but we used to run the Small Farms Network on the South Coast and work with a number of councils we investigated this quite a bit. At the stage, we were looking at trying to attract some of the Sydney growers down to the South Coast as a viable option. With that pressure being pushed out, we just kept on coming up with barriers with council in particular in terms of that economic development wanted it, planning just kept on saying no. But we were working with a number of small landholders, small farmers who were quite open to giving, leasing out 1 or 2 hectares of land. And we had this huge momentum around the food trails and the slow food movement at the time. But we just didn't have the growers. And a lot of the comments that came back from those who were keen, like young farmers, was we're not willing to invest if we're not going to get a long-term lease. And then we spent a lot of time around, well, whose role is that in terms of trying to negotiate those leases? Can we come up with a template to make it really easy for landholders and growers to go through that process? And council was trying to go, is that our role? Is that DPI, LLS's role? It sort of just went around in circles a little bit, but that was sort of our real stumbling block, is trying to make it as easy as possible to get long-term leases so they can invest in infrastructure, whether it's sheds and putting on those market gardens. We do have a couple of really good examples here on the South Coast, but there's definitely a lot more potential if we could break down those barriers. But like I said, it's been a couple of years since I've played in that space, but that was certainly a big issue for us around that Kiama, Shell Harbour, Shoalhaven area.
I think, Andrew, that the Rural Assistance Authority, they might have some templates they developed for the Young Farmers Business Program for leasing land. We'll share them after this event with everyone. But Eli, I don't know if you're still on the chat, Eli. I thought Eli worked for Byron or Tweed Council in that space, and might have been dealing with similar issues up around like the Byron Tweed area, but he might be gone now.
I'm here. Thanks, Tamara. Yep, I'm in Tweed Shire Council Sustainable Agriculture Program. Our focus is more on land management, so helping farmers look after their soils, waterways and biodiversity. But yes, certainly similar issues here with leasing challenges. We haven't done any work in that space, Tamara. But I also know Byron Council's officer down there, agriculture officer, has again similar issues, and it sounds like some of the work that's been done elsewhere might be, and including the young farmers, or the farmers, what was that, the young farmers business program could be useful starting point. But yeah, sorry, we haven't done much in that.
No,
space.
that's all right. I probably got the wrong end of the stick. Anyway, Milo,
Yeah, no,
show.
that's great.
Sorry, just jumping in a little bit as well.
Please
I mean,
do.
I guess, yeah, we've got those examples, and I think Stuart's still online around some of the work that's been done in the Eurobodella with Sage, and we've got the Grow Your Futures project down at Bega as well, which is working with small landholders or young people in particular. So yeah, there's definitely, as Eli said, there's some really good examples. It's just whether we can pull them out and make them fit different regions. Yeah.
I think it would also be good to learn from who's actually working now as well. I did interview Pocket City Farms, Jackie Besgrove, and she spoke about the challenges of starting up the small farm that they've got over in at Camperdown. And she said she would be happy to speak to anyone to not experience the same pitfalls that they went through, just making sure people have the right accreditation, the certification, know how to use equipment, so that they're not wasting so much time and money getting themselves skilled up. So it might be worth tapping into somebody like her with her wealth of knowledge to see what can be done to help small farms and those willing to, or interested in stepping in, but daunted by the prospect to find out more about the risks.
Would love to hear from anyone who works in that kind of social enterprise space, like Pocket City Farms too. So feel free to jump in if you have any comments. Yeah, I think where was I? I think I was going to ask you something along those lines, Evelyn. So feel free to ramble on while I look for another question.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I interviewed Green Connect, they have a very small workforce, and many of these farms do, but they work incredibly hard. And they're very committed to the cause. And I think there's some of the issues, Andrew, that you touched on. It's that there might be interest, but actually being committed to go through the whole process, navigate the leasing process. There needs to probably be some more work done in government to help set that up. The whole notion of the land use inventory framework that I touched on in Michigan, that's a great strategy because upfront it's identifying the potential of suitable land, where is it located, who are the owners, and maybe starting to come up with an agreement with those, if it's Crown lands or some sort of even surplus education land, as we saw. Getting some of those upfront frameworks and commitments in place might help to open the door to those that are then wanting to, the hardest step is to find the land and to have that security.
Great. We might pull up to a close there, but I'll throw over to Aaron in case he's got any closing comments as a guest.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's everyone seems like everyone's on the same page here, but I guess it keeps on crossing my mind that we're essentially selling fresh fruit and fresh produce. So we're up against the big two. It's like essentially we're trying to tap into a space where people's food buying habits are very very conditioned to not getting the fresh produce. So I'd probably, while I've got all these participants here, just suggest that they either try and support buy directly from their farmers, sign up to a CSA or go to a lunch or something like that if they haven't thought about it. I mean, to really sort of just put it back on the basics. For planning and stuff's fine, but we need to really change people's mindsets. So if anyone is interested, just go and just find a local farmer or whatever. That'd be a good step in a good direction.
Too good. All right. Well, we'll end it there. Great discussion, everyone. Huge, wide-ranging topic. We'll be sending out, as we said, recording and resources, including from this discussion. Afterwards, feel free to email or contact anyone here, I'm sure, with any questions, and we'll hopefully see what comes out of it. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.